World War I is usually remembered as a war of trenches, artillery, and unimaginable human suffering. Images of muddy battlefields, barbed wire, and exhausted soldiers dominate our memory, but this view hides a deeper truth. The First World War was not only fought with rifles and shells, it was also fought with money. Behind every offensive, every mobilization, and every prolonged battle was a silent financial war taking place far from the front lines, inside banks, treasuries, and the closed offices of powerful financiers. While soldiers paid with their lives, governments and bankers calculated costs, interest rates, and future obligations. Blood was spilled in the trenches, but decisions that shaped the outcome of the war were often made with pens, ledgers, and signatures. What happened in these financial chambers did more than decide who would win or lose the war. It fundamentally rewired the global financial system, a system whose consequences still shape your life today. War on such a massive scale was never just a political or military decision, it was also an economic gamble. The moment European leaders chose war in 1914, they also chose debt. Every army that marched toward the front lines dragged an entire population behind it, into decades of financial burden, inflation, and economic instability. Yet most governments entered the conflict believing it would be short. Many thought it would be over within months, perhaps even by Christmas. Because of this illusion, they assumed they could fund the war using traditional methods, gold reserves, limited borrowing, and patriotic donations from their citizens. That belief collapsed almost immediately. The scale of industrial warfare consumed money at a pace never seen before in human history. What followed was a transformation so profound that it changed how money itself worked. The First World War proved something dangerous and enduring. Money could be weaponized, and once governments learned this lesson, there was no turning back. In 1914, Europe entered the war believing its financial foundations were solid. For decades, the global economy had been anchored to the gold standard, a system in which paper money was directly tied to physical gold. Every major currency represented a promise that banknotes could be exchanged for a fixed amount of precious metal. This system created trust, discipline, and stability. It also imposed strict limits. Governments could not print money freely. Their power was restrained by the size of their gold reserves. At the outbreak of war, Britain, France, and Germany all possessed respectable amounts of gold. Their leaders believed this would be enough, but they underestimated the nature of modern warfare, mobilizing millions of soldiers, converting factories to produce weapons, transporting supplies across continents, and sustaining prolonged combat required sums of money beyond anything the gold standard was designed to handle. Within months, the cost of war spiraled out of control. Germany was spending more than 10 million marks every single day by late 1914. Britain's daily expenses soon reached millions of pounds. The arithmetic was unforgiving. Gold reserves were being drained at a catastrophic rate. Faced with this reality, governments made a decision that would permanently change the financial world. One by one, they suspended the rules of the gold standard. Convertibility was quietly abandoned. Citizens were told that their paper money was still valuable, even though it was no longer backed by metal. In effect, money became a promise supported only by faith in the state. This moment marked one of the most important financial turning points in modern history. It revealed how fragile real wealth truly was. Money was no longer constrained by gold but driven by printing presses, credit expansion, and political necessity. Once governments experienced this freedom, there was no incentive to return to restraint. The gold anchor had been cut loose, and the consequences would echo through the 20th century and beyond. Germany entered World War I with determination and ambition, but it faced a critical disadvantage. It was largely cut off from global financial markets. The British naval blockade prevented imports of critical goods, and international lenders were wary of funding a nation at war. With gold reserves limited and costs skyrocketing, Germany's government turned to domestic borrowing. The solution came in the form of war bonds, government-issued debt sold to ordinary citizens, marketed as both a patriotic duty and a safe investment. The propaganda campaign behind these bonds was relentless. Posters displayed heroic soldiers, urging families to sacrifice luxuries for the fatherland. Citizens were told their investments were not just financial contributions but acts of national service. Ordinary Germans were encouraged to trust that the bonds would be repaid once victory was achieved. The campaign was enormously successful. Millions of marks poured into the treasury, and the illusion of sustainable financing persisted. By the end of the war, Germany had raised over 100 billion marks through these efforts. Yet the system was a fragile pyramid built on hope rather than economic reality. When defeat came in 1918, the bonds became worthless almost overnight. Millions of German citizens lost their life savings, and the sense of betrayal was profound. The financial collapse sowed deep social and political wounds, creating fertile ground for extremism in the decades to come. Hyperinflation would later amplify these grievances, but the seeds were planted in the war itself. Ordinary citizens, who had trusted both their government and the currency, bore the brunt of the consequences. Germany's experience demonstrated a brutal truth. In a financial war, the common people suffer first. Wealthy elites often protect themselves by moving assets abroad or converting money into tangible goods, but ordinary savers and workers are exposed to the full consequences of fiscal mismanagement. The story of Germany during World War I stands as a cautionary tale, showing how patriotism and financial obligation can be manipulated to serve the ambitions of those in power. While Germany struggled to fund its war through domestic bonds, Britain and France had access to resources that would reshape the world financial order. London had long been the center of global finance, and the British pound sterling was trusted across continents. At first, the British government relied on short-term borrowing, treasury bills, and appeals to patriotic sentiment, encouraging citizens to invest in war bonds. Yet the sheer scale of World War I quickly revealed the limitations of domestic financing. Britain and France soon turned to the United States, a nation officially neutral in 1914 but brimming with financial potential. American banks, recognizing opportunity, became the lifeline for the Allies. Firms such as J.P. Morgan and Co. orchestrated vast loans, managed purchases of weapons, raw materials, and food, and ensured that Britain and France could continue fighting despite the enormous drain on their gold reserves. These financial arrangements were far from charity. Wall Street bankers profited immensely through fees, interest, and strengthened global influence. By the time the United States entered the war in 1917, American financial dominance was already established. Loans to the Allies had transformed the U.S. from a debtor nation into a creditor powerhouse. The United States, which had once followed European financial lead, now dictated terms and held the largest gold reserves in the world. This shift was not achieved on the battlefield, but in boardrooms, banks, and ledgers, a quiet revolution of power that would define the 20th century. France, meanwhile, faced similar challenges. Scarred by previous conflicts and with an economy already strained by defense expenditures, it depended heavily on both domestic bonds and foreign loans, particularly from American financiers. This increasing reliance on U.S. capital created political and economic dependencies that would echo through the interwar period. The Allies' war finance strategy demonstrated that, while soldiers fought on the front lines, a different battle for global financial supremacy was being waged simultaneously, and the winners were not always those who wielded weapons. Russia entered World War I with vast territory and manpower, but its financial foundations were fragile. The empire's banking system was underdeveloped, and although it held significant gold reserves on paper, these were insufficient to meet the staggering costs of modern warfare. Unlike Britain and France, which could draw on global credit networks, Russia depended heavily on loans from its allies, particularly France, to sustain its war effort. This dependency exposed a critical vulnerability. The Russian economy was not capable of supporting prolonged conflict on its own. As battles continued and losses mounted, inflation began to spiral. Prices rose rapidly, eroding the purchasing power of ordinary citizens, and confidence in the ruble collapsed. Soldiers at the front and civilians at home alike faced the consequences. The financial strain amplified social unrest, discontent with the Tsarist regime, and dissatisfaction among all levels of society. The inability of the government to manage war finance effectively became inseparable from the broader political crisis. By 1917, Russia's economy was in ruins, and the collapse of currency value was mirrored by the collapse of the political system. The fall of the Tsarist regime was not solely a result of ideology or military defeats. It was rooted in financial mismanagement and the inability to fund the war without destabilizing the nation. Inflation, debt, and economic chaos created fertile ground for revolution. Money and power, inseparably linked, marched together toward history-altering consequences. Russia's experience offers a stark lesson. Even immense resources and population cannot compensate for a fragile financial system in wartime. When the government loses control over its money, the effects ripple through society, undermining trust, governance, and stability. Ordinary citizens bear the heaviest burden, paying the price for the state's financial failures. The Russian collapse was a grim demonstration of how money, mismanaged on a massive scale, can topple empires as surely as any army. When the guns finally fell silent in 1918, the world was left not only with shattered cities and grieving populations but with a staggering financial crisis. The Allied powers had spent more than $140 billion, while the Central Powers had expended around $60 billion, sums that dwarfed the total pre-war national incomes of most combatant nations. The gold standard, once the foundation of global economic stability, was broken. Inflation swept through Europe, and ordinary citizens bore the brunt of the financial upheaval. Germany faced the harshest consequences. The Treaty of Versailles demanded reparations totaling 132 billion gold marks, an amount beyond the nation's capacity to pay. Attempts to meet these obligations, whether through printing money or transferring goods, triggered catastrophic economic instability. By 1923, hyperinflation had reached unprecedented levels. Germans carried wheelbarrows of worthless currency just to buy basic necessities like bread. The financial devastation fueled social unrest and provided fertile ground for extremist movements, demonstrating how economic mismanagement can have direct political consequences. Britain, too, struggled to restore stability. In 1925, it attempted to return the pound sterling to its pre-war gold value, a policy designed to signal strength and financial discipline. However, the British economy had been weakened by war, its industrial base undermined and its debts towering. The effort to peg the pound at its old parity created deflation, rising unemployment, and social discontent. Ordinary workers once again bore the costs, while elites benefited from relative insulation and the illusion of restored prestige. The United States, in contrast, faced a different challenge. Managing its newfound financial dominance, American banks began lending to Europe, facilitating reparations payments that allowed Germany to pay Britain and France, who in turn repaid debts to the United States. This circular flow of money temporarily stabilized international finance but was built on fragile logic. When the Great Depression struck, the entire system collapsed, revealing how the financial aftershocks of World War I had created a world delicately balanced on debt, promises, and paper money rather than real wealth. The financial lessons of World War I did not end in 1918. They continued to influence the modern economy. The war demonstrated that governments could finance unprecedented expenditures by detaching money from tangible assets, abandoning the gold standard, and relying on public faith, bonds, and international borrowing. Once these methods were proven effective, they became a permanent part of the financial playbook, repeated in crises ranging from the Great Depression to the 2008 global financial collapse. The pattern is familiar. Debt is expanded, money is created, and ordinary citizens are expected to shoulder the burden while elites remain insulated. The post-war era introduced a dangerous cycle of circular debt. American banks financed European reparations, which allowed Germany to pay Britain and France, who then repaid their debts to the United States. On the surface, this appeared stable, but it relied entirely on borrowed trust rather than sustainable wealth creation. The collapse of this fragile system during the Great Depression revealed the vulnerability of a world built on financial illusion. Countries interconnected through loans and bonds were simultaneously strong and dangerously fragile. Today, the same dynamics persist. When central banks claim inflation is temporary, when governments expand debt ceilings, or when new money is created digitally, the methods echo the desperate strategies of 1914. Ordinary savers, middle-class workers, and small investors remain at risk, while those with access to information and influence protect themselves. History shows that financial power is rarely distributed evenly. Those in control often benefit most, while the unprepared bear the cost. The ultimate lesson is clear. Real wealth is not merely money on a screen or promises printed by authorities. It is knowledge, awareness, and resilience. Understanding how governments and financial institutions manipulate currency and debt is the first step toward protecting yourself. History does not repeat exactly, but it rhymes. The financial playbook written during World War I remains active, and those who recognize it are the ones who can navigate its consequences. By studying the past, you gain insight into the present and the ability to preserve your own financial freedom.